All right, welcome back. Let us introduce Freudian theory. Here's Sigmund Freud. Don't look at him too closely. He's trying to hypnotize you. I wanted to just sort of use pictures to illustrate his basic theory. So the different stages of development I've got here represented in the different pictures. While I explained to you that Sigmund Freud was a medical doctor who stumbled on the idea of studying the mind or the psyche through his connections at medical school with different doctors, and Joseph Breuer was one who really influenced Freud to get interested in attempting to explore unconscious mental contents using hypnosis. Breuer had studied under a guy named Mesmer, who developed a technique called mesmerizing, which is just another word for hypnotizing someone. And so Freud really started to believe that there were unconscious contents that could be revealed through hypnosis. Well, it turns out that not everybody can be hypnotized. And so Freud was very frustrated by the fact that some people were unhypnotizable or resisted it really heavily. And so he started developing other ways of accessing unconscious contents. And that's where the name psychoanalytic theory came from. He discovered that there were certain techniques that a person could use in sort of a psychological therapy session with somebody to reveal their unconscious contents. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I just wanted to give you the history of the word psychoanalytic, which is how I first introduced this chapter, psychoanalytic theory. So this theory is based on things that Freud discovered using psychoanalysis on his patients. Now this slide is called psychodynamic theory, and so it kind of sounds like I'm about to tell you something different, right? Well, this is still Freudian theory. He believed that the different components of our personality worked in a dynamic interplay with each other. And so that's why his theory is sometimes called psychoanalytic, because he discovered the principles while, doing psychoanalysis on his patients. And then it's sometimes called psychodynamic because it's a nod to his concept of interaction among the different parts of our personality. And then finally, it's oftentimes referred to as Freudian, right? Because he was the founder. So as a medical doctor, he really emphasized the role of biology in overseeing the development of our personality. That, with healthy development, that if our needs are met correctly, that we'll just sort of go through development and as designed and end up as adults with fully functioning personalities. He also emphasized the environmental factors that can contribute to personality, mostly parenting. And while I chose a picture of a father interacting with a son for this picture, we also have to acknowledge that it's he tends to blame almost everything on mom, almost everything. So when he talks about the importance of parenting, dad's worst thing that he can do is not be dominant enough, according to Freud. So we're going to see that as we go on in this theory. So the pictures that I selected are designed to illustrate the oral stage, the anal stage of potty training, the phallic stage where gender identity is developing, the latent stage where school-based factors are the most important. I picked another potty training one as an illustration of environmental, just to illustrate how Freud really thought that our parents could help guide us through these big stages. All right, let's go ahead. Enough hemming and hawing. Now, I already introduced this iceberg earlier in chapter 1 and 2, so hopefully you watched those videos. And so I don't want to bore you too much in case you did watch those videos. If you didn't watch them, you can always go back. But as a reminder, Freud thought that our id was present at birth, that it was comprised of these motives towards always maintaining homeostasis, as what he called the pleasure principle. The idea that our id wants us to always be comfortable and not to have to be bored, not to have to be hungry or sleepy or too hot or too cold, the id always wants you to be experiencing, the perfect degree of just completely, everything's pleasant. It's comprised of psychic energy that's made up of the libido, and as you recall, that is the life force. and then thanatos, which is the death force. Some people call the libido your sex drive, and some people call the thanatos your aggression. Those are kind of simplifications. Libido is anything that's life affirming. So part of that would be sex, right? Because sex is a way to get your genes into the future. And so that affirms your life, like it will carry on past you because your genes got in the future. But libido is also the part of the id that says, it's cold, put on a jacket, because you might get sick or, hurt, get frostbite, or, like the libido says, take care of yourself, put on a jacket, eat some food. Thanatos is the part of your psychic energy that says it's okay to do harmful things as long as it makes you feel good. So a good example of thanatos at work would be, biting your cuticles. Some of you might do this, right? Where you bite your cuticles till you actually make your fingers bleed. And not to do it. Maybe you've had your hands swatted by other people. Don't do that. You shouldn't be doing that. That's wrong. You've experienced the pain afterwards where now, your finger is sore. But at the time you're doing it, it feels so good. And that's thanatos. Thanatos doesn't care that this is actually harmful. Thanatos wants you to be experiencing the pleasure that you get from it at the moment. And we could argue this is what drives people to smoke, right? Because you can put the most horrific pictures on the side of the cigarette packages, but they don't care. They're like, I don't care. It makes me feel good right now. And that's what's important to thanatos. So it might be harmful to me in the long run, but I do it because it makes me feel good. Thanatos is also the part of your psyche that tells you to celebrate when you win, even though it's hurting the feelings of the loser, right? And look, I just called them the loser. That's hurtful too, right? But Thanatos doesn't care. Thanatos is like, but I'm happy. I don't care about that person's feelings. This feels good right now, even though I might be upsetting the person who, agreed to play a game with me. It makes me feel good, so I'm going to do it. So Thanatos, and libido, it's a lot more complex than just sex and aggression. It's more about, maintaining your pleasure all the time. The libido being the life affirming components of that, and Thanatos being sort of the harmful or destructive parts of that. Ego, as we mentioned before, starts to develop around 6 months of age, and it operates on the reality principle. So starting at about 6 months, but really you start to see more and more as the child ages, evidence that they're trying to settle the id's demands based on reality-based decisions. So you don't just dance around and celebrate and say in your face and everything to the poor person who you just beat playing dominoes. Because that might feel good to the id, but the ego says, well, this person's never going to play dominoes with me again if I make them feel bad. You might do it once when you're little, you see how the other person feels bad, doesn't want to play with you in the future, and you say, you know what, I can't do that. Reality tells me that even though id wants to do this giant celebration, that would be rude. I will never have anybody to play with again. So ego tries to figure out a way to satisfy the id's demands while also taking it, reality into consideration. So maybe instead of a big celebration, inside your head, you go, yes, I killed them. That's right. I'm so good at dominoes. Right on. But then you go, oh, that was a good game. You really put up a good fight, right? So in your head, you get to do the celebration, but outwardly you congratulate the loser for a good game, right? We try to teach our kids that from the time they're really little to be good winners, right? Well, we're trying to teach them, the rules. And actually that's part of the superego development, is us trying to teach them what they should be doing. Now, this superego part doesn't really start to develop until the child's about 5 years of age. And it's going to ultimately serve as conscience. Now, I have to be truth in advertisement. Freud didn't really like that simplification of calling it the conscience. He thought it was much more nuanced than that. Frankly, I have studied Freud for decades, and I don't really get the difference. Maybe it's a language issue. He was writing in German, and maybe the word for conscience and the word for superego, or what he was trying to explain was what superego as. Maybe it translates as conscience in English, but it's not what he really means. I'm not sure. I think it's a perfectly fine thing to just shorthand it as your conscience. It's the part of your personality that has internalized all the morals, all the morality lessons, all the the messages about what it means to be a nice person versus a mean person. Like the superego would tell you that it's wrong to overtly celebrate when you win because it's not nice, right? A nice person doesn't do that. You don't try to hurt someone else's feelings, according to the superego. Now, I'm telling you things that you probably agree with, right? Because according to Freud, we all get sort of taught by our environment, starting with our parents, and then our teachers encourage us to internalize these rules. Our peers encourage us to internalize these rules, like it's not right to cut in line. Our peers will let you know that really quick. Even if all the line is lined up for is to go back to class, kids will be like, don't cut in line. You can definitely agree with no cutties when you've been waiting all night to get tickets to this concert that you want to go to. You're like, definitely no cutsies in that circumstance, but no cutting in line to get into the classroom first. Like that seems weird, but see, kids really, they have internalized that there are certain rules and we're not supposed to violate them. Like it would be wrong. And that's superego at play. It takes a lot of years for kids to start internalizing these rules and then to start, sort of implementing them on their own without an adult to remind them what the correct behavior is. And so a lot of parents have an inappropriate expectation for their children that they should be able to tell their 4-year-old, this is wrong, don't do this, this is why it's wrong, this is why I don't ever want to see you do it again. And then that 4-year-old does the behavior again, and the parent thinks, this 4-year-old is just defying me and is trying to make me upset or is just not following the rules that I've set down. But they're forgetting that it takes a little while for kids to be able to internalize those kinds of rules and be able to implement them themselves. They need parents, they need adults to remind them that this is, say please, say thank you, that we don't kick, that, even if you're frustrated, you don't kick someone, you don't do these things. It takes a really long time for kids to internalize that. Think how big and powerful that giant id is that has been present since birth, and how influential it's going to be over this poor little baby superego that's trying to develop in a 3 or 4-year-old, right? Like it's starting to try and maybe get a little bit about the rules and trying to understand why the rules are what the rules are and things like that. It's just a little baby, tiny superego. It really can't present itself very well. So it's really super important for adults to realize that little kids can't be expected to show, conscience-based, restraint when they're little. You've got to really help them, guide them. Freud says maybe by the time they're 8, and actually a very prominent developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, agrees that it isn't until about 8 that you can start to expect children to have any ability for their moral learnings to override their baser instincts. Like it's too much to expect otherwise. The job of the ego is to have little meetings with the superego and the id below the water level in the unconscious that you're not aware of this little meeting happening. The ego hears what the id wants, hears what the superego wants to do, and the ego tries to figure out some solution based on the context of reality where both the superego and the id will have a chance of having their motives being satisfied. Some people think, well, it's always better to default to the superego, but it's actually not. I mean, there are times when the appropriate solution is for you to get to enjoy pleasure. And there are times when the correct solution is for you to be pious and moral and give up things for other people. Most of the time, it needs to be some balance between those things where your needs from the id get met and your needs from the superego get met in some way, attempting to balance them out. It's not always the case that, just always default to the superego. The superego has good intentions. Not really, because the superego doesn't care if you get deprived. The superego doesn't care if you're unfulfilled, right? So it's not perfect to just go with the superego. It's definitely not perfect to just always go with the id, right? You don't always want to just run around taking advantage of other people, doing whatever feels good to you and not worrying about anybody else's feelings. Like that's not appropriate either. All right, well, I'm going to stop here. And what you'll find next in the playlist is an illustration of the role of the ego trying to negotiate between the id and the superego. And then we'll come back and I'll continue after that with Freud's psychosexual stages.